Ron, Art Krumrey.
Nice to see you, Art.
So thank you for joining us this afternoon here at the Noble Seymour House. We at the Norwood Park Historical Society are trying to document some of the history of Norwood Park. And I understand that you've been in this neighborhood for quite a bit of time.
Born and raised here.
I'd like to hear about your stories.
Fine. I was born and raised in Norwood Park. Born in a house on Nettleton, 6116 Nettleton. The house is still there. It was the second house my father built for his family. And we moved at about the time of World War II into a property that on the corner of Nettleton and Raven. My grandparents came here in the 1890s. They bought a house on the corner of Raven and the Northwest Highway. Bought a house from the Campbell sisters. And I'm not quite sure who the Campbell sisters were, but that's who Grandpa bought the house from. And the property was located just behind where the insurance office is now, on the corner of Raven and the highway.
So that would be the northeast corner.
Northeast corner, that's right. Grandpa owned that triangular block of Raven Street, Northwest Highway, and Newark. And he sold lots to his two older sons who built houses. One where the current library building is, and one where I think a doctor's office is there. Grandpa was involved in real estate here in Norwood and encouraged his boys to get into the same. He owned a mortgage on the bank building at Northwest Highway in Raven.
Was it the name Kelder? Was this Kelder, the name of the business?
It wasn't a formal business,
okay.
yes.
I see.
Well, he did it in his own name.
I see.
And Grandpa got antsy about the bank at the time of the Depression and sold the mortgage, didn't want it. And his son thought that that was still going to be a rock solid investment. So he went and bought the mortgage. He said, "Don't tell Grandpa that I did that." So they invested in mortgages, which is what one did back in those days. That was one typical investment opportunity. So I was born in, lived all of my life in Norwood until I moved out to college, and then to school beyond college, and then on to life beyond that. But
Where did you go to college?
I went to Wright Junior in Chicago, and then went to University of Illinois, Champaign, and that was delightful. That was like a whole new universe that opened up, and I found that exceedingly exciting. And then I ended up going to a seminary religious seminary in Rochester, New York. And again, that was something that blew my mind wide open. It was exposure to the world and ideas that I had never experienced before.
What religious denomination?
That was an American Baptist seminary. And I served a church in Rochester, and then one in western Pennsylvania, close to Steubenville, Ohio, right on the western Pennsylvania border, and then another church in Cleveland, Ohio. And so I was in the ministry for 25 years. That all started because of another old name in Norwood Park, Celeste Hanneman, who was a kindergarten teacher at Onahan School. She lived on Newburgh Avenue, and she was attending the Baptist Church in Norwood Park. And she would stop by for me and offered to take me to Sunday school. And I got started going to Sunday school at the Baptist Church. And one thing led to another, and I was very active in the church. The church nurtured my growth, and I was a part of the Boys Brigade, which was a boys club in the church. And I think everything I learned about recreation, therapy, education, I learned through that activity. It stood me in good standing through ministry in 3 churches and working in vacation Bible schools where I am now. I learned that through the Baptist Church.
So you still do religious activities in these vacations?
Very much. Active in St. Luke Presbyterian Church in Downers Grove.
I see.
Back to Norwood. That was because of Celeste Hanneman, rather, who did that. The Hannemans were very kind to my mother. After my brother left home and I went away to college, my mother lived alone in a house at the corner of Navarre and Nettleton. And Celeste used to stop by and would visit with her. And my mother loved to take Sunday afternoon rides. And Wally would take her Celeste and Wally would take her for a ride. She would go to Sauganash. She loved to rubberneck at fancy houses in Sauganash. And she thought that was just marvelous until Wally, who was a policeman, he said, thus and such a gangster lived in that house and a criminal lived in this house, destroyed the whole aura for my mother. She didn't enjoy the rides as much anymore.
So what was life like in Norwood Park when you were growing up?
Life in Norwood Park for me was very quiet, and I was a very shy young boy, and though I had an exciting job, I used to be a soda jerk, and I worked for Pankow Pharmacy. Then that pharmacy was in the building that my uncles built on the corner of Raven and Northwest Highway, and I had a job to work there as a soda jerk, which meant that I could eat all the ice cream I wanted. Mr. Pankow thought that if he allowed such a practice, I would get sick of ice cream and he wouldn't have a problem. Never has happened in the last 70 years. But I was a soda jerk. I would make ice cream sodas on Sundays and have a chance to talk to girls if they came in, if I could think of anything to say to girls, which I had trouble doing. And then the piece de resistance, I had a chance to drive the Jeep delivery truck. There was no job that was better for a teenage boy than to eat ice cream and to talk to girls and to drive the Jeep delivery truck. It was marvelous.
And imagine the customers were happy to see you come.
He should have been, yes. That was the one story about Norwood Park.
So then you went to Wright and U of I, and then came back to Norwood Park?
I went to Wright and U of I, and then I served churches in Rochester, New York.
Oh, that's right, you went to the seminary then. Yeah.
Yes, and in Western Pennsylvania and in Cleveland. And then came back. We were a part of a religious order in Chicago for a number of years. And when we left the order, my brother had a Newtown house that he had bought and as an investment in the city of Bolingbrook, southwest of Chicago. And so we moved there and started living in Bolingbrook, which where I live right now, but I come back to Norwood to be a docent in the Historical Society.
Go back to your family business and the Kelder Mausoleum in Union Ridge.
Ah.
That sounds like an interesting story.
Grandpa had a daughter. There was only one girl and 5 boys. And his daughter died of diphtheria when she was 12. And the family never quite was able to deal with that grief. And so Grandpa decided to build a mausoleum in Union Ridge Cemetery. And Sounded like a good idea at the time and didn't turn out to be. He immortalized his daughter in a stained glass window in the mausoleum, which is a thing of beauty. It's a piece of art glass.
And it's still there?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
And there are 8 crypts in the mausoleum. And there were enough for he and his wife and his 5 sons. And he wasn't thinking of the fact that his 5 sons had wives and they had children, and it just was not adequate. And there were family squabbles over who was in and who was not in. And but at any rate, related to the mausoleum, when a year ago, my cousin, one of the first young boys who enlisted from Norwood Park in World War II, when his body was returned from Japanese prison camp burial in the Philippines, he was able to be reinterred with his mother in the crypt with his mother in that Kelder Mausoleum. It was a very moving story about Buddy's return. Very difficult thing. It was hard to accomplish, and I didn't accomplish it, but we had a relative who was able to. He brought suit against the Department of Defense in order to get Buddy's remains returned.
So the notes say that he came back in 2016? His body was
finally, yeah.
Very, very recently.
He would be, he would have been 100 years old, but he was buried in Manila as an unknown. And we found data that could have verified DNA, and the government didn't want to move.
The notes refer to a break-in in the mausoleum.
One New Year's day, New Year's Eve, some vandals broke into the mausoleum, and her name escapes me right now, the lady that runs the cemetery. She was afraid to call us and to tell us what had happened. They broke the brass doors in the front, and I had visions of all kinds of devastation that could have happened. What happened was they broke the lock, and broke into one crypt, and in the process broke the marble slab, and opened my uncle's coffin. Didn't do any damage. I think they were just doing mischief.
I see.
Probably were drunk.
Yeah.
Weren't caught, but that was a.
But it was since repaired.
It's been repaired, yes, and rather bizarre. Learned things about marble. That marble is soft, it sags, and the reason the big slab broke is they broke into the bottom one crypt, but the weight of the marble on top of it squashed it, so they couldn't open it up. When my cousin was buried last year, in with his mother, we had to take a stone saw and cut the joint to relieve the pressure.
The notes talk about your research into the nobles, the Seymours and the Crippens, and your role as a reenactor. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I guess I'm a ham. They asked me to conduct a house tour during the wine festival, wine tasting. And when people came to the wine tasting, they weren't interested in doing an historical tour. They had their minds on partying. So there was not a lot for me to do. And the idea occurred to me to do a little street theater. So I bought a uniform of a Keystone Cop sort of thing. It's not real authentic, but it's close. It's got a long coat like Bob Trigger, who was our policeman in Norwood Park when Norwood was first annexed to the city of Chicago. The way Chicago handled public safety then was they employed one man as the policeman for this new community that was annexed. Bob Trigger lived up on Harlem Avenue, close to Nina in Harlem, and he could see from his house all the way down to the railroad station. It was clear enough at that point that he could see when a train came. And you couldn't get to Norwood when he was employed anyway, except via the railroad. Northwest Highway didn't exist. Harlem Avenue wasn't paved. You couldn't get here.
I heard stories that he greeted the trains.
That's the way Bob Trigger kept Norwood safe. His beat was Raven Street, between the highway and across the tracks, and he would guide school children across the tracks in morning and at lunchtime and after school, because that was a dangerous crossing. An awful lot of people have been killed crossing those tracks.
Yes.
But since you couldn't get here and vandals couldn't come to Chicago via motor car, he would greet the railroad trains when they came, and if he didn't recognize you, and if you couldn't convince him that you belonged here, he would turn you around and put you back on the train, and he was big enough to do that.
Yeah, there's a picture of him upstairs in the history
That's
room,
right.
so anybody who visits the museum can see a rather tall man.
That's right. Yeah, that's Bob Trigger. So during the wine tasting festival, I dressed in a uniform of a Keystone cop with a white hat instead of the other kind of police cap. And I talk about early Norwood Park, and where can a cop get a cup of coffee and a donut in Norwood Park? And of course, people don't know what restaurants existed back then. This is the we talk some shtick.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to develop another character where I'll be Thomas Seymour. Thomas Seymour was the person who built this Italianate addition to the Norwood House. And he was one of the shakers and movers when Norwood was being organized.
And he was a farmer, right?
No, he was businessman.
Oh,
he flagged down the train.
It was Mark Noble who was the farmer, the original.
Mark Noble was a farmer,
yeah.
right. And so I'm imaging Thomas Seymour as a real estate huckster on television, late night television, with a derby hat and a red vest. And I want to sell you some real estate and see if I can develop some shtick during the wine tasting.
Oh, that would be fun. That would really be fun.
It's some fun, yeah. And it tells some history too.
But he made his money in real estate in Norwood Park or the greater.
Mark Noble?
Yeah.
Thomas Seymour? He was on the grain exchange, I understand, downtown.
Oh, I see.
Don't know what his other sources of income were. I don't know that about any of his life before he came to Norwood. He was an investor when he came here. And the first wave of people in Norwood, there were rich investors who came from the east, who bought up some of that farmland that was set aside and designed, plotted for housing. And these investors sold that real estate, and then those wealthy people moved on. One incarnation of the Baptist Church in Norwood happened back then when Norwood was first forming, and a number of those investors were Baptists. And they sold the property that they bought and they moved on, and the Baptist Church kind of collapsed around them. That was the first incarnation of the Baptist Church in Norwood. When the Crippens moved here, they were instrumental in restarting the Baptist Church in town. And in fact, the Baptist Church met in this house for a while.
Is that right? I did not realize the depth of the religious history of this house and this community.
Yes, it's interesting. Mark Noble was a very active Methodist layman, and this was preaching station number 26 on the Methodist Circuit Ride, which means that the Methodist preacher who was the circuit rider, he would make stops at each of the preaching stations, and he might get here once a month, and maybe not any more than that.
Oh.
In fact, one of those circuit riders lived in Plainfield, Illinois. That's where his home was. And then he would travel from Wisconsin to middle of Illinois and don't know that they went very far into Indiana. But one of the preaching stops was right here at Mark Noble's place. And the way they advertised, they said that this was Father Noble's on the North Branch of the Chicago River. Well, we're quite a ways from the Chicago River. It's down off of Devon Avenue in Caldwell Woods. But we're, when I lead a tour of the house and we have children, I tell children that our front gate was at Superdog, because that's at the corner of Devon and Milwaukee Avenue. And children will scratch their heads, and Superdog wasn't here then. And I said, well, I give that description, Father Noble's on the North Branch of the Chicago River. That's almost at the Chicago River. So that's kind of like our front gate. There would be a path that led from there up to the Noble house. And that's where we would have church. And you would come, some people would come via the North Branch, paddling a canoe or walking along the towpath along the edge of the river.
Very interesting. So let's wrap it up by just talking about your ethnicity. You're Dutch, as I see from the notes. And there's not too many Dutch in Norwood Park.
And yet the first church in town was the Dutch Reform. It's interesting. Yeah. The Presbyterian Church, now the
Meditation Center.
Meditation Center. Yeah. Was first, the first incarnation was a Dutch Reform. I think there was a religious, I think they call it comedy, where as a community is beginning to organize and needs to form a church, they will turn to one denomination, say, you work here, and somebody else will work there. And I think that's how it happened.
I see.
During the Depression, the Dutch Reform sold the mortgage to the Presbyterians, and it became a Presbyterian church then thereafter. Dutch heritage. There was an evangelical Dutch preacher back in Groningen in the northern province of Holland, and just about, virtually his whole congregation moved here, moved to Chicago, moved to the Groningen Hoek, or that immigrant community. The first Dutch Reformed church on the corner of May and Harrison. May, not May. Well, it's right close to the Eisenhower Expressway. At any rate, his church became the center of Dutch activity. That's where my grandfather met his wife. He would write letters back to Holland and became the travel agent, and people migrated here. Their first stop would be at the church, and probably they would live with church members for a short while when they arrived here in town. He was a banker for the Dutch community, really a node in the community. I don't know that Grandpa was a part of his community in Holland, but he was a part of that community, was married by that preacher here in Chicago. Grandpa eventually became a merchant on the South Water Market, and some people, and it may just be family, called him the celery king of South Water Market. He imported a lot of the celery from the Dutch farmers in the south side of Chicago growing celery on the muckland. The Dutch people were farmers. From Groningen, they were farmers. And they saw this as a land of opportunity. They could get a whole freight car full of cow manure from the stockyard for free.
Oh, of course, yes.
For free. They had never heard of anything like that. And so this was just the land of opportunity.
Did any of them settle in Norwood Park?
Nope, not except for Grandpa.
I see. So he was the exception. Huh?
The Dutch tended to move to the south when they would buy a piece of land and would live on it and would farm it, and then decide they needed more land, so they would move farther south. And they moved down to Englewood and to Roseland. They moved as far as DeMott, Indiana. I have relatives in DeMott, Indiana, and I said, why there? And I was told it's swampland. They drained the swamp and farmed on the muckland. And but Grandpa was an individual, and he decided not to go south. He moved north. And don't know how he heard about Norwood, but he did.
I'm glad he did, because otherwise you wouldn't be here.
Thank you.
So Ron, it's been fun talking to you. I'm looking forward to seeing you reenact the Thomas Seymour heritage at the Wine Festival. And
Very good.
we'll be in touch.
Thank you.